The silence was the heaviest thing in the room. It was a physical weight, pressing down on Eira's shoulders, more burdensome than the thick furs draped over the bench. Outside, the wind howled a mournful dirge through the timbers of the longhouse, a bitter echo of the screams from the battlefield that had stolen her husband. In the hearth, the fire was a ghost of its former self, embers glowing a weak, defeated orange, mirroring the last vestiges of hope in her chest. She clutched a small wooden bird Bjorn had carved for her years ago, its edges worn smooth by the constant worry of her thumb. His laugh, a deep and resonant boom that could shake the rafters, slammed into her memory, and the tears she thought had long run dry began to fall anew. The quiet was not just broken, it was shattered. A hard, violent fist hammered against the heavy oak door, a sound that spoke not of courtesy but of brutal urgency. It was the sound of the outside world, the world of blood and steel, refusing to honor her sanctuary of grief. Eira flinched, her heart seizing in her chest. For a fleeting, foolish moment she imagined it was him, somehow returned. But the rhythm was wrong. Bjorn's knock had been a steady, confident beat. This was a frantic, impatient pounding, a demand, not a request. It was the sound of a crisis that had followed the warriors home from the battlefield and was now standing, unwelcome, on her very doorstep, waiting to drag her out of the past and into a terrifying, uncertain future. The door swung inward before she could even rise, pushed open by a figure silhouetted against the gray, unforgiving light of dusk. It was Hilda. Her armor was still caked with the mud and drying blood of the men she had fought beside and fought against. Her face, usually alive with a fierce competitive fire, was a mask of hollowed-out exhaustion and grim determination. She offered no words of comfort, no gentle nod of condolence for the woman who was her Jarl's widow. Her gaze swept the room, dismissing the scattered remnants of a shared life, and landed on Eira with the cold, calculating assessment of a warrior judging the strength of a shield before battle. In that single unpitying glance, Eira understood that her time for mourning was over. Hilda took 3 heavy strides into the room, her iron-soled boots leaving muddy tracks on the floor rushes. She stopped before the hearth, her presence sucking the last of the warmth from the air. To her, this scene was one of dangerous indulgence. She saw the woman Bjorn had loved, the gentle soul who sang their children to sleep, and mended the deepest of wounds with a quiet touch. But she also saw the woman who had never lifted a sword, who had never felt the jarring impact of a shield blocking a death blow. In this moment, with an enemy poised to strike, that gentleness was not a virtue. It was a fatal weakness, a sickness that could infect and destroy them all. Hilda's loyalty was to Bjorn's legacy, and she feared she was looking at the very person who would let it burn. Without ceremony, the ultimatum was delivered, each word a sharpened stone hurled into the fragile quiet. Jarl Sten and his wolves can smell blood on the wind, Eira. Hilda's voice was raspy, raw from battle cries. They know the Jarl has fallen. They are not celebrating a victory. They are planning a slaughter. They're coming to finish the job Bjorn started. She paused, letting the horror of the words sink in. The council is fractured. The warriors are leaderless, squabbling like pups over a bone. They look for a sign, for a leader. Your husband is gone. Hilda's eyes locked onto Eira's, devoid of all sympathy. The clan will not die with him. We cannot afford your grief. Every syllable struck Eira like a physical blow. This was not a conversation. It was an accusation. In Hilda's hardened gaze, she saw not just the urgency of their plight, but a poorly veiled contempt for her perceived fragility. She felt the Shieldmaiden's rage, a desperate and angry grief that had no outlet but to lash out at the nearest symbol of the life they had just lost. Eira was that symbol, the soft heart of Bjorn's iron rule. She was the peace he fought for, and in this new brutal reality, peace was a luxury, a memory that had no place among the survivors. Hilda's words were a dagger twisting in the fresh wound of her loss, telling her that the very love that defined her was now a liability. A memory surfaced, a lifeline in the storm of her despair. It was a quiet night, years ago, under a sky littered with stars. Bjorn had taken her hand, his own calloused and scarred, and held it to his chest. He had seen the fear in her eyes before a coming raid. "Your strength, my love," he had whispered, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "It isn't in your arm. It's not in the swing of an axe." He had gently touched her temple with his finger. "It's here." Then he moved his hand to her heart. "And here. It is a strength of deep roots, not of sharp edges. A strength they don't yet understand, but one day they will depend on it. The memory was a shield. The choice, which had seemed impossible moments before, began to crystallize through the fog of her pain. To flee, to abandon her home and her people, to let them scatter to the winds and seek refuge with other clans. What would that be? It would be an admission that everything Bjorn had built, everything he had bled for, was nothing without him. It would be to kill him a second time, to let his legacy turn to ash, and be swept away by the same wind that now carried the scent of their enemies. His strength was gone from the world, but hers, the one he had seen so clearly, remained. It was a flickering ember, but it was not yet extinguished. She looked up, meeting Hild's impatient, stony stare. The tears on her cheeks began to cool in the drafty air. A resolve she didn't know she possessed began to rise from the depths of her sorrow, a quiet but unbreakable force. Her voice, when it came, was not the roar of a Jarl, but it did not tremble. It was low, steady, and carried the weight of a decision that would change everything. "No," she said, the word hanging in the air between them. "The clan will not die with him." She pushed herself to her feet, her spine straightening. "I will not let it." She saw a flicker of surprise, or perhaps disappointment, in Hilda's eyes before the warrior's mask of indifference fell once more. Hilda gave a short, sharp nod, though her expression remained unconvinced, her eyes filled with a deep, pragmatic skepticism. "Words are wind, Eira," the Shieldmaiden stated flatly, her tone a clear challenge. A promise made in a warm longhouse is easily broken by the cold steel of an enemy's axe. She turned toward the door, her message delivered, her duty done for the moment. "The council of elders and warriors gathers at dawn. They are afraid, and their fear makes them hungry for a strong arm to lead them." She paused at the threshold, looking back over her shoulder. "They will not be convinced by a widow's tears. They will demand a leader. Be ready to give them one." The door closed, leaving Eira alone once more, the silence now filled with the crushing weight of an impossible promise. The great hall was thick with the smell of wet wool, stale ale, and fear. Dozens of warriors and elders were crammed onto the long benches, their faces grim in the flickering torchlight. Their murmurs were a low, anxious hum, the sound of a hive without its queen. When Eira entered, a hush fell over the room. She wore no armor, carried no blade. Her simple, dark tunic was that of a grieving wife, not a contender for a seat of power. She felt their eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. They saw Bjorn's widow, a woman to be protected, pitied, or perhaps set aside. They did not see a leader. The air was heavy with doubt, a suffocating blanket she would have to tear through with nothing but her will. One of Hilda's lieutenants, a burly, bearded warrior named Torvin, rose to his feet. His hand rested on the pommel of his sword, a gesture of casual intimidation. "Lady Eira," he began, his voice booming across the hall, leaving no room for the honorific to be anything but a dismissal. "We honor your grief, but we do not have time for it. Jarl Stinn's scouts were seen at the edge of the woods this morning. We need a war leader, a Jarl who can meet them on the field with an axe in hand. We need a sword to command us, not a healer's gentle touch to mourn us after we have fallen." A rumble of agreement went through the assembled men. They wanted a reflection of Bjorn, another iron fist. Eira walked slowly to the center of the hall, standing before the high seat, Bjorn's seat, that sat cold and empty. She did not look at Torvin. Instead, she let her gaze travel over the faces of the men before her. She saw the exhaustion etched around their eyes, the fresh scars on their hands, the deep-seated worry for the families they had left in their homes that morning. She let the silence stretch, forcing them to look at her, to truly see the woman who had shared their lives for years, not just the abstract concept of a leader. She let their own anxieties fill the quiet, turning their focus from what they wanted to what they truly feared. It was a gamble, a moment of vulnerability that could either command their respect or cement their contempt. Finally, she spoke, her voice not loud, but clear and resonant in the tense hall. "I see warriors before me," she began, her eyes meeting one man's, then another's. "I see the shields that have protected this clan for a generation, but I also see fathers. I see sons. I see the hands that built these very walls, and the shoulders that will have to carry the future of our people." She did not speak of battle, of glory, or of vengeance. She spoke of them, of their lives beyond the battlefield. Torvin speaks of swords, and he is right. We will need them. But a sword is a tool, and a tool is only as good as the hand that wields it, and the mind that guides it. She took a step closer to the assembled men, her presence filling the space in a way they hadn't expected. "Tell me," she asked, her voice imbued with a quiet authority, "did Bjorn fight for the glory of the fight alone? Did he raise his axe only for the thrill of conquest?" She paused, letting the question hang in the smoky air. "Or did he fight for the quiet mornings that followed? For the moment when your children would wake up safe in their beds, with food in their bellies and a roof over their heads? He fought for what came after the battle. He fought for survival. Vengeance is a fire that warms you for a moment, but it will burn your house down if you let it." A subtle shift occurred in the room. Some of the men, who had been leaning forward with aggressive certainty, now sat back. A few looked down at their own hands, as if seeing them for the first time, not just as instruments of war, but as the hands that held their own children. Eira had not challenged their pride as warriors. Instead, she had appealed to a deeper, more profound duty, their responsibility as protectors and providers. She was reframing the entire conflict, moving it from a simple question of revenge to a complex problem of survival. She was forcing them to think beyond the next fight and consider the next winter, a battle no axe could win alone. Torvin, sensing he was losing the room, pushed back, his voice laced with frustration. "These are fine words, my lady, but Jarl Sten's axes will not be stopped by talk of empty bellies and safe children. They will be stopped by a shield wall and the courage to meet them head on. We need a plan for war, not a lesson on fatherhood." He gestured wide with his hands, appealing to the warrior instincts of the men around him. "Who will lead the charge? Who will stand in the front rank? That is the question that needs an answer today." The tension in the hall ratcheted back up, the men torn between two different kinds of strength. Eira did not raise her voice. She simply met Torvin's heated gaze with a calm, unwavering stare. "And how many of our sons, our brothers and our fathers are you willing to feed to Sten's axes before our shield wall breaks?" she asked, her question sharp and precise. "How many pyres will we build? How many families will we leave with nothing but memories? A victory that leaves us a clan of ghosts and orphans is no victory at all. It is a slower, colder death than any Sten could give us on the battlefield." Her words were not a plea, but a cold, hard statement of fact. The wisdom of a healer who knows that sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease itself. From the back of the hall, leaning against a wooden pillar, Hilda watched the exchange, her face an unreadable mask. She had expected Eira to falter, to be devoured by the aggressive posturing of the warriors. Instead, she was witnessing something else entirely. She saw the men's faces, their certainty beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by a thoughtful, troubled contemplation. Eira wasn't trying to be Bjorn. She wasn't offering them another axe. She was offering them a reason to fight that went beyond honor and blood. For the first time since she had hammered on that door, a seed of doubt was planted in Hilda's mind. Not about Eira's weakness, but about her own narrow definition of strength. Eira let the weight of her question settle in the hall. She knew she did not have their loyalty yet, only their momentary, grudging attention. "I am not my husband," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet every man strained to hear it. "I cannot lead you in a glorious charge. But I know this land, every stream and every shadow. I know our people, our strengths, and our needs." She looked at the empty Jarl's seat. "Give me until the next full moon. Give me a chance to show you a different path to survival, one that does not ask you to sacrifice the very future you are fighting to protect. If I fail, you can choose Torvin, or any other, to lead you to an honorable death. But first, give me the chance to lead you to a difficult life." The council was silent, the choice hanging, unresolved, in the air. The silence that followed her words was a different kind than the one that had filled her longhouse. It was not a silence of grief, but of stunned contemplation. The men on the benches, who had been ready to shout their approval for Torvin's call to arms, now sat motionless, caught between the warrior's path they knew and the uncertain one Eira had just laid before them. Torvin's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief, his jaw tight with fury. He saw this not as a strategic proposal, but as a woman's trickery, an appeal to fear that dishonored the memory of their fallen Jarl. In that moment, the hall was not a council of a unified clan, but a room divided by two futures, one of glorious, certain death, and another of difficult, uncertain life. Eira turned and walked from the great hall without waiting for their verdict, her every step feeling impossibly heavy. She did not feel the flush of victory, only the cold dread of the promise she had just made. The weight of their gazes on her back was a physical force, each one a question she had no answer for. Had she just saved her people, or had she merely delayed their destruction? The memory of Bjorn's confidence felt like a distant shore she could no longer reach. She was adrift in a sea of her own making, armed with nothing but a desperate hope and a knowledge of herbs and seasons. The men in that hall wanted an axe to follow, and she had offered them only a whisper and a prayer for time. Hilda caught up with her just as she reached the cold, wind-swept air outside. The Shieldmaiden's expression was no longer one of simple contempt. It was something more complex, a grudging curiosity mixed with profound skepticism. "A full moon," Hilda stated, her voice flat and hard as river stone. "Sten will not give you that long. His scouts are wolves, not snails. What you just did in there, was it courage, or was it a fool's bargain to buy yourself a few more days of peace?" It was not just a question. It was a challenge, a demand to see beneath the calm facade Eira had presented to the council. Hilda needed to know if she was following a leader or a ghost. Eira stopped and faced her, the wind whipping loose strands of hair across her face. She did not flinch from Hilda's piercing gaze. "I am not buying peace, Hilda. Peace is what we had, and it is gone. I am buying survival," she answered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Bjorn taught me that the strongest shield wall can be broken by a single starving man from within. He taught me that an army marches on its stomach, and that winter is a more patient killer than any Jarl. You see only the battle that is coming. I am trying to see the morning after, and the winter after that. That is the only victory that matters now." Her first act as their provisional leader was not to visit the training yard or the armory. Instead, she went to the long, low building where they kept their winter stores. The air inside was cool and smelled of smoked fish, dried grains, and earth. She ran her hands through barrels of barley, mentally calculating how long it could last if stretched. She took stock of every salted side of pork, every bundle of dried herbs, every wheel of hard cheese. This was her battlefield, a place of logistics and foresight. An army, even a victorious one, that returned to an empty larder, was a dead army. She was waging a war not just against Sten, but against the coming cold and darkness, an enemy that could not be met with a sword. An old woman named Eira, whose face was a roadmap of winters past, watched Aya from the shadows of the storehouse. She had been the keeper of these provisions for 40 years, and had seen Jarls come and go. She approached Eira not with the deference given to a Jarl's widow, but with the quiet respect of one pragmatist for another. "The warriors see only the strength of their shield arms," Eira said, her voice raspy like dry leaves. "They forget that the strength to lift a shield comes from here." She patted a sack of flour. "Sten's men will come with fire and steel. Let them. Fire needs fuel, and steel grows heavy in a weak hand. You are wise to count our food before you count our graves." Leaving the storehouse, Eira sought out the clan's hunters. She found them mending their nets and sharpening their skinning knives, men who lived apart from the boisterous culture of the warriors. They were quiet, patient men who knew the forest not as a path to battle, but as a living, breathing entity. She didn't ask them about fighting, she asked them about the land. Where does the ground turn to swamp after a heavy rain? Which ridges are plagued by rock slides? Where do the briars grow so thick that even a deer cannot pass? She listened intently, her mind building a map of their territory that was far more detailed than any drawn on hide, a map of traps, obstacles, and unseen dangers. Meanwhile, in the mead hall, Torvin's voice was a low growl of discontent, fueling the fears of the warriors who had gathered around him. "She counts beans while wolves circle our home," he spat, slamming his drinking horn on the heavy wooden table. "She speaks to trappers and old women. Is this how we prepare to meet the men who killed our Jarl? With stories of mud and mushrooms? Bjorn would have us sharpening our axes, not hiding behind the skirts of a woman who is afraid of a little blood." A murmur of angry agreement rumbled through the men. They were warriors, and their new leader was asking them to think like anything but. That night, Eira sat alone in her longhouse, the fire burning low once again. A large piece of cured leather was spread across the table, and with a piece of charcoal, She was sketching the landscape she had just learned about. She drew the winding creek, the treacherous marsh, the narrow pass in the hills. These were not just features of the land, they were weapons. She was a healer, accustomed to understanding the systems of the body, its weaknesses and its strengths. She was now applying that same knowledge to the body of the land itself. The weight of her promise settled on her shoulders, a suffocating cloak of responsibility. She felt so utterly alone. A frantic pounding on her door, eerily similar to Hilda's arrival, shattered the silence. A young boy, one of the lookouts, stumbled into the room, his face pale with terror and exhaustion. He had run all the way from the high ridge. "My lady," he gasped, struggling for breath, his eyes wide with fear. "Sten's army. We saw their fires. They are not scattered. They are marching as one. They are not days away, as the council thought." He looked at her, the terrible truth of his message plain in his gaze. "They will be at our gates by sunrise tomorrow." The full moon she had bargained for had just vanished from the sky. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to undo the fragile calm Eira had fought so hard to project. The news of Sten's imminent arrival spread through the settlement faster than a flame through dry grass. Voices were raised in fear and anger. Torvin seized the moment, standing on a bench in the center of the village, his sword drawn. "Her time is up," he roared, his voice carrying over the rising din of alarm. "Her plans of traps and tricks have failed before they have even begun. We must ride out now, as men. We will meet them on the field and die with honor, not cower here and wait for the slaughter." He was offering them a familiar, honorable death, and in their terror, many were ready to take it. Eira walked out into the chaos, her face a mask of composure she did not feel. She did not try to shout over Torvin. Instead, she walked to the village bell and pulled the rope, its deep, resonant clang cutting through the noise. Once, twice, 3 times. It was a signal for emergencies, a sound that demanded attention. The crowd quieted, their faces turning to her. "Torvin is right," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden hush. "There is no more time for preparation." She then gave her first true commands, not as a debater but as a leader. "The smiths will not forge swords. They will forge caltrops. Scatter them on the main path. The hunters will not take bows. They will take horns and drums, and make the noise of an army 10 times our size in the woods to the east." She then turned to the women, who were clutching their children, their faces fraught with worry. "You will not hide," Eira told them, her gaze sweeping over them, empowering them. "You will take every pot, every cauldron, and fill it with water. Put them on the fires. When the time comes, boiling water will stop a charging warrior as surely as any spear." She was turning their home into a fortress, and every single person into a soldier. She was not asking them to fight like men. She was asking them to fight as a village, using the tools of their own lives as weapons of war. It was a strategy born of desperation, but also of a profound understanding of her people's true collective strength. Hilda stood at the edge of the crowd, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. Every instinct screamed at her to join Torvin, to rally the warriors for a proper shield wall, to meet the enemy head-on in the way she had been trained since she was a girl. It felt dishonorable to hide, to rely on tricks and traps. It felt like an admission of weakness. Yet, as she watched Eira organize the entire village, giving everyone a purpose, a role in their own defense, she saw a terrifying logic in the plan. It was a coward strategy, perhaps, but it might be the only strategy that would allow any of them to see the next sunset. Eira found the clan's blacksmith, Ulf, a mountain of a man with arms as thick as small logs, furiously sharpening an axe. "I need spikes," she told him, her voice calm but firm. "Hundreds of them. And caltrops, as many as you can make before dawn." Ulf glared at her, his face grim. "A warrior needs a sword in his hand, my lady, not a handful of thorns to throw on the ground." Eira met his gaze without backing down. "A sword can kill the man in front of you, Ulf. A field of unseen spikes can break the charge of their entire vanguard. It can turn their greatest strength, their numbers, into their greatest weakness. I don't need you to arm our warriors. I need you to disarm theirs." A strange energy began to take hold of the village. The initial panic was replaced by a frantic, focused activity. The sound of hammers on anvils rang through the night, but they were not forging blades. They were creating small, wicked-looking iron caltrops. Children, their fear momentarily forgotten in the face of a task, gathered piles of stones near the palisade walls. The hunters, their faces grim, disappeared into the forest, carrying not spears but torches and hide drums. Eira was not just building a defense, she was weaving the very fabric of their community into a weapon Sten would never anticipate. Every person had a part to play in the coming storm. Walking through the torchlit chaos, Eira felt a profound shift. She was no longer just Bjorn's widow. The grief was still there, a cold stone in her chest, but it was now surrounded by an overwhelming sense of purpose. She saw the faces of her people, looking to her not with pity, but with a desperate, burgeoning hope. They were afraid, yes, but they were no longer lost. She had given them a plan, a way to fight back that did not rely solely on the dwindling number of their warriors. In their eyes, she saw the reflection of a leader, and for the first time she did not recoil from it. She finally understood what Bjorn meant. Her strength was not in her arm, but in her ability to see the strength in everyone else. Torvin, his face a mask of rage at seeing his authority evaporate, cornered Hilda near the gate. "Look at this madness!" he hissed, gesturing to the women hauling pots of water. "This is not a defense. It is a farce. Bjorn died for this clan, and she dishonors his memory by turning us into skulking rats. Are you truly going to follow her? The Shieldmaiden of our great Jarl, taking orders from a woman who has never even held a shield?" He was making his final play, appealing to Hilda's deep-seated loyalty to the man they had both loved, trying to frame Eira's strategy as a betrayal of everything Bjorn stood for. Hilda looked from Torvin's furious, pleading face to the organized, desperate industry of the village. She saw the hidden pits being dug, the nets being strung between trees, the sharpened stakes being hammered into the ground along the palisade. It was ugly, unglamorous, and utterly without honor. It was also, she admitted to herself, with a cold certainty, their only chance. "Bjorn is dead," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "and his memory won't stop Sten's swords from cutting our throats." She turned her back on Torvin, her decision made. She would follow the plan. She would see if this strange, quiet strength Eira possessed was real. Hilda found Eira near the main gate, directing a group of older men as they rigged a massive deadfall trap above the path. The Shieldmaiden said nothing. She simply walked over, bent down, and wrapped her powerful arms around one of the anchor logs, her muscles straining as she helped haul it into place. After the log was secured, she stood up, wiping the sweat and dirt from her brow. She looked directly at Eira, her eyes filled with a grim resolve. "Show me where you need me, my Jarl." The word, once an honorific she could barely bring herself to utter, was now a statement of allegiance. Just as the sound left her lips, the high, piercing blast of a lookout's horn echoed from the watchtower. One long note. The enemy was in sight. A wave of cold dread washed over Eira, but she forced it down, climbing the ladder to the watchtower with a speed she didn't know she possessed. Hilda was right behind her, her hand never far from her axe. The world seemed to shrink to the small wooden platform and the scene unfolding below. At the edge of the forest, just beyond the effective range of their archers, a dozen horsemen had emerged. They were Sten's vanguard. Their wolf-head banners flapped lazily in the pre-dawn breeze. They weren't attacking. They were sitting there, a portrait of arrogant confidence, observing the village, waiting for a reaction. Eira's breath caught in her throat. She understood the tactic instantly. It was a test. Sten was a brute, but he wasn't a fool. He was probing for weakness, trying to gauge their numbers, their readiness, their leadership. He expected a small, desperate band of warriors to ride out in a blaze of foolish glory, to be easily encircled and destroyed. He was dangling bait, hoping to lure their remaining strength out from behind their walls. The fate of the entire village, she realized, might not depend on the battle itself, but on how she responded to this single, silent provocation. The wrong move now would mean annihilation before the first sword was even swung. Below, Torvin's voice was a furious roar. "It is an insult! They mock us at our very gates. Are we to do nothing?" He paced back and forth, trying to rally the warriors near him, his frustration boiling over. "Let us ride out and send their heads back to their master." Several of the younger warriors raised their axes with a shout, their bloodlust stirred by the blatant challenge. They looked up at the watchtower, waiting for the order, ready to charge to their deaths. They saw the enemy, and their only instinct was to attack. They couldn't see the larger trap that was being laid for them. Eira ignored him. She turned to the archers who stood beside her on the platform, their bows already drawn. "Hold," she commanded, her voice a low, steady whisper that cut through the tension. "Do not loose a single arrow." She then looked at Hilda, whose knuckles were white where she gripped the tower's railing. "They expect us to be a wounded animal, lashing out in fear and pain. They expect a warrior's response. We will give them nothing. We will give them silence. Let them see a village that is not afraid. A village that does not see them as a threat worthy of a response." It was a gamble that required a discipline she wasn't sure her warriors possessed. For a long, agonizing minute, the world stood still. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the nervous shuffle of feet on the ground below. The horsemen at the edge of the woods did not move. The defenders on the wall did not move. It was a battle of wills, fought across 100 yards of empty space. Every warrior in the village was straining against the instinct to fight, to answer the blatant disrespect being shown to them. They were holding their positions based on the command of a woman who had never known battle, and the strain was immense, a palpable force in the air. Eira stood as still as a statue, but inside her, a war was raging. This was Bjorn's greatest test, she thought. He would have met the challenge. He would have answered steel with steel. Was she honoring his legacy with this strange, passive defiance? Or was she proving Torvin right? Was this strategy, or was this simply fear wearing the mask of wisdom? The silence from the enemy was a mirror, reflecting all of her deepest insecurities. For one terrifying moment, she felt the urge to give the order, to send the archers, arrows flying, just to break the unbearable tension. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, the leader of the vanguard, a man with a deeply scarred face, let out a loud, derisive laugh that carried across the field. He spat on the ground in a final gesture of contempt, then wheeled his horse around. The others followed suit, melting back into the shadows of the forest as quickly as they had appeared. They had seen what they came to see, a village too terrified to even defend its own honor. They would report back to Sten that the clan was broken, its warriors leaderless and cowering behind their walls, ready for an easy slaughter. A collective, shaky breath of relief rippled through the defenders. They had held. But Torvin was incandescent with rage. "You have shamed us," he screamed, his voice raw with fury as he pointed a trembling finger at Eira. "You let them spit on our home, and you did nothing. They think we are cowards." Before his words could incite another panic, Hildu stepped in front of him, her body blocking his path. Her voice was cold as ice. "No," she said, her eyes fixed on the forest where the riders had vanished. "She has blinded them. Now they will walk into our traps, believing there is nothing to fear." Eira descended the ladder, her legs shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. The cold morning air felt sharp in her lungs. She knew the vanguard's report would only make Sten more reckless, more confident. The real attack would come with the rising sun. As her feet touched the ground, the old storekeeper, Eira, emerged from the shadows and pressed a small, tightly bound leather pouch into her hand. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. "There is more than one way to fight a war," the old woman whispered, her ancient eyes holding a flicker of something dark and dangerous. "Some poisons attack the body, others attack the mind." Eira looked down at the pouch, then toward the silent forest, and a terrible new possibility unfolded before her. The weight of the small leather pouch in her hand felt heavier than any stone. Eira's fingers traced its stitched seams as the first pale light of dawn crept over the palisade. Elara's words echoed in her mind, a serpent's whisper of an alternative war. A war fought not with steel, but with something far more insidious. As a healer, she knew the properties of 100 different herbs, those that could soothe a fever, and those that could induce a sleep from which one never woke. Was this what leadership required? To become a purveyor of unseen death, to poison wells or taint food stores? The thought coiled in her stomach like a cold snake. It was a line she had never imagined crossing, a betrayal of the very life-giving principles that had defined her existence until now. A tense hush had fallen over the entire village. The frantic energy of the night had given way to a silent, collective holding of breath. From her vantage point on the watchtower, Eira could see it all. Men and women stood at their designated posts, faces grim and pale in the growing light. The fires beneath the cauldrons of water hissed softly, sending plumes of steam into the cold air like ghostly signals. There was no boasting, no war cries, only the quiet, determined readiness of a people who knew they were standing on the precipice of their own extinction. Every person, from the oldest man gripping a sharpened farming tool to the youngest boy with a pile of stones, was a thread in the fragile tapestry of her desperate plan. Near the western gate, hidden from Eira's direct line of sight, Torvin gathered a small cadre of warriors who shared his simmering resentment. His voice was a low, venomous growl, a countercurrent to the village's unified purpose. "Her tricks have bought us a night, nothing more," he seethed, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword so tightly his knuckles were white. "When their main force comes, this nonsense with traps and boiling water will fail. They will break us. When that happens, we do not die like cornered rats. We meet them on our feet, with Bjorn's name on our lips. We fight as he taught us, not as this healer commands." He was planting a seed of rebellion, offering a path of glorious death over one of uncertain survival. The sun broke over the distant peaks, and with it, they came. At first, it was just a dark line at the edge of the forest, a smudge against the horizon. But it grew, resolving itself into a river of men, a tide of iron and leather that flowed into the open field before them. The sheer number of them was a physical blow, far more than their scouts had estimated. At their head rode Jarl, a bear of a man mounted on a massive black warhorse, his wolf-head banner a stark silhouette against the morning sky. He did not charge. He arrayed his forces with a terrifying, disciplined patience, a clear sign that he was not the reckless brute they had hoped for, but a calculated and confident commander. The attack began not with a roar, but with the sharp crack of a whip. Sten's vanguard moved forward at a steady, disciplined trot, their shields locked. They were expecting arrows, a volley from the walls. They were not expecting the ground itself to become their enemy. The first horses hit the field of caltrops and screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound of animal agony. Riders were thrown, their disciplined advance dissolving into a chaotic tangle of flailing limbs and wounded animals. The charge was broken before it had even truly begun, but it was only their first line. The rest of the army halted, their surprise and anger a palpable wave that rolled across the field toward the silent village. Eira watched, her heart pounding against her ribs. The first trap had worked. It had sown confusion and bought them precious moments. But Sten was not deterred. He barked an order, and a second wave of warriors, this time on foot, began to advance, their movements more cautious. They picked their way through the field, using their spear shafts to probe the ground ahead. He was adapting, learning. This would not be a single, decisive battle, but a grueling contest of attrition, a deadly chess match where every move could be their last. She felt a cold dread seep into her bones. Her plan relied on surprise, and the element of surprise was already beginning to fade with the morning mist. From a hidden position on the wooded ridge to the east, Hilda gave a sharp, silent command. A volley of arrows flew, arcing high over the field to descend on Sten's advancing men. They were not aimed to kill, but to harass, to disrupt their formation and force them to raise their shields, slowing them down even further. As soon as the arrows were loosed, Hilda and her small band of archers melted back into the trees, ready to move to their next prepared position. It was the warfare of ghosts and shadows, a constant pricking at the enemy's flanks. Hilda fought against every instinct that screamed for a direct charge, her discipline held in check only by the memory of Eira's cold, unwavering logic. Sten's men finally reached the palisade, their frustration having boiled over into a savage rage. They threw grappling hooks over the walls and began to climb, their axes held in their teeth. This was the moment the warriors had been waiting for, the chance to meet steel with steel. But before they could, the women of the village acted. They tipped the heavy cauldrons, and sheets of boiling water cascaded down the wooden walls. The screams that followed were inhuman, a sound of agony so profound it momentarily silenced the entire battlefield. Men fell, their skin blistering, their armor offering no protection from the scalding liquid. It was a horrific, brutally effective defense born from the heart of the home. The main body of Sten's army was now pinned down, taking casualties from the archers on the ridge and the defenders on the wall. But Sten was a veteran of 100 battles. He stared at the chaos before him, his eyes scanning the terrain, looking for a weakness, a flaw in the design. Eira followed his gaze from the watchtower, and her blood ran cold. He was looking at the western woods, a dense tangle of ancient trees and thick briars that the hunters had sworn was impassable. He barked a new set of orders, and a huge contingent of his warriors, perhaps a third of his entire force, broke away and began marching not toward the gate, but directly toward that impenetrable forest. A ripple of fear went through the defenders on the wall. They all knew that flank was their weakest point, left with only a token guard because they had trusted the land to be their defender. What did Sten know that they did not? Eira's mind raced through the possibilities. A traitor who had shown them a hidden path? An old map? Or was Sten simply gambling, betting that the impassable woods were, in fact, passable for a determined army? Her entire defensive strategy was built on a foundation of knowledge, a map of the land she held in her mind. In a single moment, Sten had ripped that map to pieces, leaving her dangerously exposed and with no clear path forward. The sight of the enemy flanking them sent a surge of panic through the village. All eyes turned to the watchtower, to Eira. This was the moment Torvin had predicted, the moment her clever tricks would fail. He saw his opportunity and seized it with both hands. "To the west gate!" he roared, his voice cutting through the rising fear. "She has led us to our deaths. We will not wait for them to surround us. We meet them on the field. For Bjorn!" He was no longer whispering dissent. He was openly defying her command, rallying the warriors who still believed in a glorious death over a strategic defense. He was creating a schism in their ranks at the worst possible moment. Hilda saw it happening from the ground. She saw Torvin's reckless appeal to honor and the desperate look in the eyes of the warriors wavering between his command and Eira's. The plan was crumbling. The enemy was at their weakest point, and their own forces were about to shatter from within. She looked up at Eira on the tower, expecting to see fear, to see indecision. Instead, she saw a chilling, focused calm descend upon the woman's face. Eira had seen the betrayal, she had seen the flanking maneuver, and she was not breaking. She was calculating, her mind working furiously to find a way out of the collapsing trap. Eira's voice rang out, sharp and clear, not a scream of panic, but a command of absolute authority. She did not speak to Torvin. She spoke to a young runner standing near the base of the tower. "Tell the hunters on the eastern ridge to light the signal fires. All of them! Now!" The order was madness. The threat was in the west. The fires would do nothing to stop the flanking force. It was a nonsensical command, a waste of their last trick. The runner stared up at her, his face a mask of confusion. "Go!" Eira screamed, and the sheer force of her will sent the boy sprinting toward the eastern woods, leaving everyone else to wonder if their new leader had finally lost her mind under the pressure. Ignoring the chaos erupting below, Eira grabbed a bow from a fallen archer on the tower. Her hands were clumsy, unfamiliar with the weapon, but her aim was not for a man. She knocked a fire arrow, lit it from a nearby brazier, and drew the string back with all her strength. The muscles in her back screamed in protest. She wasn't aiming for Sten's army. She was aiming for the deadfall trap above the main gate, the one meant to be triggered by a rope. The rope had been severed in the fighting. She loosed the arrow. It flew in a high, wobbling arc, a desperate prayer of fire sent into the sky. The flaming arrow struck the dry timbers of the deadfall's housing. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, a small lick of flame appeared, catching on the dry wood and oil-soaked ropes. As Torvin and his renegade warriors threw open the western gate to charge out to their doom, the fire in the east consumed the supports of the main trap. With a groaning crack of splintering wood, the entire apparatus, tons of rock and sharpened logs, crashed down directly in front of the main gate. It didn't kill a single enemy soldier. Instead, it completely blocked the primary entrance to the village, sealing them all inside with the enemy that was now pouring through the breach Torvin had created. Torvin and his 20 men were met by a wave of hundreds. Their charge was not glorious, it was suicidal. They were engulfed, cut down in a brutal swirling melee that lasted less than a minute. But their foolish act of defiance had a terrible, unintended consequence. They had drawn the bulk of Sten's flanking force to the now open western gate, creating a bottleneck of carnage. As warriors poured through the opening, they were met not by an organized shield wall, but by a frantic, desperate defense of smiths, farmers, and the few loyal warriors who had not followed Torvin, all fighting with a savagery born of utter desperation. From the east, huge plumes of thick, oily smoke began to rise into the sky, just as Eira had commanded. The hunters, following her baffling order, had lit their fires. To Sten, who was still directing the assault from the field, it looked as though a massive, hidden army was emerging from the forest behind him, signaling an attack on his rear. He saw his men getting bogged down at the western gate. His main assault route was now blocked by a wall of rubble and logs, and a potential new enemy was appearing behind him. The poison of doubt, the fear that this was all part of a more complex trap, began to cloud his judgment. Eira scrambled down from the watchtower, her heart a block of ice in her chest. Torvin was dead. The west gate was breached. Her people were fighting and dying in a desperate struggle inside their own walls. Her grand strategy had shattered into 1,000 pieces. All that was left was a brutal, close-quarters brawl for survival. She ran toward the fighting, the small leather pouch from Alara still clutched in her hand. She ripped it open with her teeth. It was not filled with poison. It was packed with a dense, dark paste of herbs, yarrow to staunch bleeding, willow bark for pain, and a powerful, bitter stimulant to grant a surge of desperate energy. She found Hilda, fighting like a cornered wolf near the breach, her axe a blur of motion, her face a mask of blood and fury. The Shieldmaiden had been trying to organize a defense, but was being overwhelmed. Eira grabbed her arm. "Here!" she yelled over the din, smearing the dark paste into a deep gash on Hilda's shoulder. "For the wounded, it will keep them on their feet." In that moment, Eira was no longer a Jarl, no longer a strategist. She was a healer, moving through the chaos of the battle, her hands working to mend, to strengthen, to keep her people in the fight for one more precious second, her presence a strange, calming anchor in a sea of violence. The battle for the western gate became a meat grinder. Sten's forces, confused by the signals from the east and meeting ferocious resistance, could not bring their superior numbers to bear in the narrow space. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood. Eira, moving just behind the front line, became the heart of the defense. She wasn't fighting, but she was enabling the fight, her quick hands and knowledge of the body keeping warriors standing who should have fallen. The sight of her, unarmed and fearless amidst the slaughter, ignited a fire in her people. They were no longer just defending their village, they were defending her. A massive champion from Sten's army, his face covered in swirling blue tattoos, finally broke through the line, scattering the defenders before him. He saw Eira, her hands covered in blood, as she tended to a fallen farmer, and his eyes lit up with savage glee. Killing her would break their spirit completely. He raised his massive, two-handed axe, a triumphant roar building in his throat. Hilda, seeing the danger, tried to intercept him but was blocked by two other warriors. For the first time, Eira was completely exposed, with nothing between her and a brutal death but a few feet of blood-soaked ground. Without thinking, Eira grabbed the discarded shield from the mud. It was heavy, awkward, and she had no idea how to use it properly. She simply held it up, planting her feet as the tattooed warrior charged, his axe raised high for the killing blow. She remembered Bjorn's words, whispered so long ago, "Your strength, my love, isn't in your arm." In that moment, facing certain death, she finally understood. Her strength was not in her ability to wield the shield, but in her unyielding refusal to let it fall. The axe began its descent, a gleaming arc of steel promising to shatter her world for a second and final time. The tattooed warrior's axe never landed. A spear, thrown with incredible force and precision, took him in the throat. He stumbled, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, before collapsing into a heap at Eira's feet. Eira looked up, her heart hammering against the shield. Standing on the roof of a nearby longhouse was one of the hunters she had spoken to days before. He gave her a single grim nod before nocking another arrow, his eyes already scanning for the next threat. Her trust in them, her willingness to listen, had just saved her life. It was a victory not of strategy, but of community. The tide of the battle, which had seemed so certain just moments before, began to turn. Sten's hesitation, born from Eira's bluff with the signal fires, had given the defenders a crucial window. The fierce resistance at the gate was costing him far more men than he had anticipated. His warriors, seeing their champion fall, began to falter. The assault lost its momentum, devolving from a confident charge into a bloody, uncertain slog. The will to fight was draining from them, while the defenders, inspired by Eira's presence, fought with the strength of a people who had found something new to believe in. Hilda, her wound packed with the herbal paste, finally broke free and stood beside Eira, her axe dripping. She looked at the dead champion, at the hunter on the roof, and then at Eira, who was still holding the heavy shield with trembling arms. "Your plan worked," Hilda said, her voice filled with a raw, breathless awe. "Even when it fell apart, it worked." Eira looked at the chaos around them, at the dead and dying on both sides. "This isn't victory, Hilda," she replied, her voice shaking. "This is survival. The cost of that survival was written in the blood that soaked the ground at their feet." Sten, watching from the field, finally sounded the retreat. The cost was too high, the situation too uncertain. His men began to pull back from the gate, dragging their wounded with them, their confident advance having shattered against an unexpected wall of resilience. They left behind a field littered with their dead. The defenders did not cheer. They stood, leaning on their weapons, watching the enemy recede, too exhausted and grief-stricken for celebration. They had held the line. They had survived the day. But the silence that descended was filled with the ghosts of those they had lost, including the men who had followed Torvin to their deaths. Eira let the shield fall from her numb fingers. It landed with a heavy thud in the mud. She looked at her hands, stained with the blood of her people and the herbal paste she had used to save them. She had faced the enemy, she had faced betrayal from within, and she had not broken. She was still the healer, still the woman who had wept for her husband in the cold longhouse. But she was also something else now, something forged in the brutal crucible of that morning. A leader who had won a battle not with an axe, but with a whisper, a bluff, and an unshakable belief in her people. As the last of Sten's army disappeared back into the forest, Hilda turned to Eira. The Shieldmaiden's face was a ruin of exhaustion, grief, and something new, unquestioning respect. She did not kneel. Instead, she did something more profound. She reached out and gently took the heavy shield from the ground, her gaze fixed on Eira's. "Let me carry this for you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My Jarl." The words were no longer just a title. They were a vow, an acknowledgement that the strength Bjorn had seen in his wife was the very thing that had just saved them all. Eira looked over the devastation of her home, the bodies of friends and foes alike. The cost of this day was staggering. She felt no triumph, only a deep, aching weariness that went all the way to her bones. She had bought them another sunrise, but she knew this was not the end. Sten was wounded, but not defeated. He would be back, angrier and more cunning than before. She had won the battle, but the war for their future, for their survival, had only just begun. And she, the healer who had never wanted power, was now standing at the very center of it, the weight of it all, settling upon her shoulders like a shroud. In the end, it was not a rout, but a breaking of will. Jarl Sten, his face a mask of thunderous disbelief, watched his finest warriors pull back from the gate, their confidence shattered, their ranks thinned. He gave the order to retreat with a gesture of pure fury, his grand conquest having crumbled into a bloody and humiliating defeat. The remaining defenders on the walls did not cheer or raise their axes in triumph. They simply stood, silent and swaying with exhaustion, watching the tide of their enemies recede back into the forest. The air, thick with the smell of blood and scorched wood, was filled only with the ragged breathing of the living and the profound silence of the dead. They had survived, but the morning felt less like a victory and more like a reprieve. Eira let the heavy shield fall from her numb fingers, its clatter in the mud a final, definitive sound. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling, stained with the rich, dark soil, the blood of her people, and the herbal paste she had used to hold them together. She had not swung a sword. She had not taken a life. Yet the outcome of this day was as much her doing as any warrior's. She had wielded panic and knowledge as weapons, turning her home into a deadly puzzle Sten could not solve. She felt the ghost of the woman she had been just yesterday, the grieving, helpless widow, and realized that woman was now as dead as the men who lay at her feet. A new kind of silence settled over the village, heavier than the one that had filled her longhouse. It was the quiet of aftermath, punctuated by the low moans of the wounded and the soft weeping of those who had found their loved ones among the fallen. Eira moved through the devastation, her brief and terrible role as a battle commander dissolving away, replaced by the familiar motions of the healer. She knelt in the mud, her hands now working to close the very wounds her strategy had caused, her presence a steady, quiet anchor in the sea of pain. She was there, Jarl, but in this moment of shared suffering, she was simply Eira, tending to her own. Hilda stood a few feet away, her axe held loosely in one hand, her body a canvas of cuts and bruises. She watched Eira gently bind a young boy's arm, her voice a low murmur of comfort. The Shieldmaiden saw it all then, the two halves of the woman who had saved them. She had seen the cold, calculating mind that had outmaneuvered a seasoned warlord, and now she saw the gentle heart that bled for every single loss. Hilda understood that Eira's strength was not a replacement for Bjorn's, but something else entirely, a power that could both plan a slaughter and then grieve for the souls it had cost. It was a leadership forged in both fire and healing. Near the shattered western gate lay the bodies of Torvin and the men who had followed him. Eira stood over them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She felt a profound and aching sorrow, not just for the waste of their lives, but for their inability to see beyond the familiar comfort of a glorious death. They had died for Bjorn's memory, but they had misunderstood his legacy entirely. He had not fought for honor in death, but for the chance at a difficult life. Their sacrifice was not a noble last stand. It was a tragic, final lesson in the cost of pride, a lesson she would carry with her for all the days to come. The grim work began as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the carnage. The dead were gathered, their limbs straightened, their faces washed clean of the fury of their final moments. Eira made a decision that caused a murmur among the warriors. Sten's dead were to be collected as well, placed on their own pyres. They were sons and fathers too, she said, her voice quiet but firm, leaving no room for argument. Our war was with their Jarl, not their memory. It was an act of strange, unnerving grace, a clear signal to her people that, while she would fight with brutal cunning to protect them, she would not let them become the monsters they fought against. Inside the great hall, now a sprawling infirmary, the air was thick with the scent of herbs and human pain. Eira worked alongside Eira, the old storekeeper, their movements economical and practiced. They said little, communicating with the shared understanding of those who live in the world of remedies and consequences. As Eira finished stitching a deep wound on a warrior's leg, Eira placed a wrinkled hand on her arm. The old woman's eyes, deep and knowing, held a universe of approval. The sapling that bends in the storm lives, Eira whispered, her voice like rustling leaves. The great oak that resists is broken. You taught them how to bend today. That night, the sky was ablaze with the light of the funeral pyres. The entire village stood in a somber circle, the heat of the flames a stark contrast to the cold grief that bound them together. Eira stood among them, not above them, her face illuminated by the dancing light. She did not speak of glory or vengeance. She spoke of the empty chairs at their tables, of the stories that would go untold. She spoke of their shared loss, giving them permission to grieve not just for a Jarl, but for their friends, their brothers, and their sons. Her words were a balm, a gentle hand on the raw wound of their victory. She spoke of Bjorn, her voice clear and steady. She shared a memory of him not on a battlefield, but on a quiet summer evening, mending a child's broken toy with the same focused intensity he gave to a war plan. He fought so that we could have more evenings like that, she told them, her gaze sweeping over their tired faces. He did not die so that we could become a clan of ghosts, chasing his shadow into an honorable grave. He died so that we could live. Our survival is his true legacy. That is how we will honor him, by living. She had reframed their grief into a purpose, a foundation for the future. Just as the last of the great logs on the pyres began to collapse into a mountain of glowing embers, a scout appeared from the darkness, his face grim, his breathing ragged from a long run. He had not followed Sten's main force. He had tracked a small, elite group of warriors who had split off during the retreat. They were not heading home. They were moving fast, traveling light. heading north toward the treacherous, ice-choked passes of the frozen fells. It was a place of ill omen, a land of exile from which few ever returned. Stan had been defeated, but he had left a piece on the board, a mystery that felt like a new and undefined thread. Eira listened to the scout's report, her mind already working, fitting this new piece into the larger puzzle. The threat of the frozen fells was a problem for another day. For now, the needs of her people were immediate and overwhelming. The gate had to be rebuilt, the wounded needed constant care, and the dwindling winter stores had to be reevaluated and strictly rationed. She moved from one task to the next, with a quiet, relentless efficiency that was more commanding than any shouted order. Her authority was no longer a question to be debated. It was a simple, observable fact, as solid as the palisade walls she was now directing to be reinforced. When the council of elders and warriors next gathered in the great hall, the air was transformed. The benches were filled with the same men, but their posture was different. The aggressive skepticism was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful respect. They had seen her cleverness, they had witnessed her courage, and they had felt her compassion. They had looked into the face of annihilation and been pulled back by the woman they had once dismissed as a gentle healer. Torvin's empty seat was a silent testament to the folly of underestimating her, a warning that echoed louder than any speech could have. Hilda, her arm in a sling but her back ramrod straight, stood before the high seat. "I followed Jarl Bjorn because he was the strongest arm in our clan," she announced, her voice ringing with conviction in the quiet hall. "I will follow Jarl Eira because she is its strongest mind." She then turned, faced Eira, and dropped to one knee, a gesture of fealty she had offered to no one but Bjorn. "My axe and my life are yours, my Jarl. Lead us, and we will follow." One by one, the other warriors rose and placed a fist over their hearts, a silent, unified pledge of loyalty that sealed her authority for all time. Later that night, Eira stood alone in the quiet of her longhouse. The fire burned brightly in the hearth, a steady, confident flame. The silence was no longer a weight of grief, but a space for thought, for planning. She reached up and touched the small wooden bird Bjorn had carved, which she now wore on a leather thong around her neck. The sharp, aching pain of his memory had softened, replaced by a deep, resonant strength. He was no longer a ghost that haunted her. He was an anchor that held her steady. She felt not his absence, but the enduring power of his belief in her. She caught her reflection in the polished surface of a bronze shield hanging on the wall. The woman who stared back was a stranger. Her eyes, which had once held a soft, gentle light, were now shadowed with exhaustion and a deep, unsettling wisdom. Her face was thinner, harder, etched with the lines of impossible choices and unbearable loss. This was the face of a Jarl, a face forged in the crucible of fear and fire. She did not recognize the woman she had become, but for the first time, she did not look away. She accepted the stranger in the shield as herself. The weeks that followed were a blur of hard labor and quiet healing. The village was slowly stitched back together, the scars on its walls and its people beginning to fade. Eira's leadership was a constant, steady presence. She did not rule from the high seat, but walked among her people, her hands as often covered in flour from the kitchens as they were in ink from the supply ledgers. She established a new order based not on martial pride, but on shared responsibility and pragmatic survival. The clan, which had been on the verge of shattering, was now more unified and resilient than it had ever been under Bjorn's iron fist. Hilda found her one evening, poring over the charcoal map spread across her table. The Shieldmaiden's gaze was serious. "He will be back, you know," she said, her voice low. "A man like Stan does not forget a humiliation like this. He will come back with a larger army, with fire and with rage." Eira didn't look up from the map. A small, grim smile touched her lips. "I know," she replied, her voice calm and certain. "But next time, we will not be waiting for him here. Next time, we will not be the prey, cowering in our den." Her finger traced a path on the cured leather, moving away from their village and into the treacherous broken lands to the north, toward the very passes the scout had mentioned. "We will not let him choose the battle," she continued, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight. "We will choose the ground. We will choose the time. We will use the land itself as our shield wall, and the winter as our axe. He expects to find a wounded animal. He will find a patient hunter who has set a trap he cannot possibly imagine. She was no longer the defender of a legacy. She was the architect of a future. Hilda stared at her, a slow, profound understanding dawning on her face. She finally saw the full scope of Eira's transformation. The gentle healer had not just become a leader. She had become a predator. Bjorn fought like a bear, Hilda whispered, her voice filled with a new kind of awe. All strength and fury, meeting the enemy head-on. She looked at the map, at the intricate, deadly plan taking shape under Eira's hand. You fight like the winter wind. Unseen, relentless, and inescapable, he never stood a chance. Eira finally looked up, her gaze meeting Hilda's. She touched the wooden bird at her throat, a final connection to the man who had seen this strength in her all along. The grief was a part of her, a deep, cold river that would always run through her soul. But it was no longer a flood that threatened to drown her. It was a source of power. She had lost the love of her life, and in the ashes of that loss, she had found herself. Not a warrior queen, not a Shieldmaiden, but a Jarl whose legend would be whispered not in tales of glorious battle, but in the quiet, enduring story of her people's survival.